Literary Pub Crawl's in-depth knowledge and underground cult status has brought passion for history, literature, and drinking to the village since 1998. Their Greenwich Village tour is one of the oldest continuing operating tours in the village. Eric Chase is one of the co-founders of Literary Pub Crawl, and I am going to turn this over to him without further ado to introduce his team to us. So Eric, take us away.
All right, thank you very much for that, and welcome everybody. We appreciate you taking the time to join us today. As you mentioned, we've been doing this tour for about 1998, usually in person. Our flagship tour, the Greenwich Village tour, we started in 98, originally as a fundraiser for a theater company. But as theater companies tended to struggle financially, we decided to kind of stick to what we did best, which was drink and talk about writers. We have a Brooklyn tour that we used to run when you were allowed to see people, and a Times Square tour, which we, all three of which are excited to get started again, as well as we do educational tours that don't go to bars for the obvious reasons, and other author-specific tours. And this is actually a tour that we had put together for Literary Manhattan about 7 or 8 years ago specifically, and when Ariel and I were talking about doing some virtual tours, we kind of wanted to see how we could turn this into the virtual means here. So my name is Eric. I've been running this for a while. With me, I am joined by Marissa, who in my layout is right there. She's been on the tour since about 2009. I believe that she came on a tour with a couple of other guides, came up afterwards after having a little bit of whiskey and said, "How do I do this?" And they said, "Well, you need to talk to Eric." And so she came on my tour and she said, "How do I do this?" And I said, "Well, we like people who have a passion for literature." And then I had to sit down for about 30 minutes while she explained to me everything about the beat writers and Jack Kerouac and the NYU. And I said, "Okay, I think you might be a right fit for this." She has a Bachelor of Arts from NYU, master's degree in fiction from Stony Brook University. And she actually has a debut novel coming out called The World Gives Way. It's going to be published by Hatchet Orbit Publishing, scheduled for this fall. And I'm already putting down the details because we'll be doing a Marissa Levine literary pub crawl at some point once that book comes out.
It'll be fall of next year. They're not that fast with it, but.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, I'm just going off a bio that was submitted to me by a Marissa Levine. So you can't say anything about the date. She's also a black belt, so keep the comments to yourself. But we're really excited to have her join up with this tour. This is the third virtual tour that we've done, and we're slowly getting better at it each time. Also with me is Devin, who, Devin. You know, I think we should just move on to more important stuff. He's a nice guy, and we're sort of grateful that he's on the tour. Thanks, Devin. So as we mentioned, this is our third virtual tour that we've done. And one of the things that we're trying to do is go beyond just doing a documentary. We're not just television. We're not just doing a Zoom PowerPoint presentation, although we will have it. We are trying to make it a little bit more interactive. We're trying to use the medium to its fullest possibility, and we're still learning. I'm frantically controlling several machines while I'm also trying to talk and recite. And one of the ways that we'll do that, as you may see, is we'll have some polls. And actually, Ariel, can you put up the first poll? We will have a few of these that will periodically pop up. Some are meant to be, now it does kind of come in the center of your screen there. I'm not sure if you can see it, but the advantage is with the poll, not only can you answer, but if you get your mouse sort of to the top, you can slide it over to the side. So if for some reason it's blocking a view you don't like, yeah, there you go. Yeah, just grab it, drag it. Good. You can do that, and then obviously you do a quick answer, and then it will pop up quickly with an answer and gone. So we're going to try to time it to not block much because it will pop up. But again, if there is an issue, you can move it off to the side. And sadly, Marissa and Devin can't answer any of these questions, but I would probably go for number 3. But that being said, we're going to, look at that. A1. So we are here to talk about and here we go, my technical problem issue. Mr. Jack Kerouac, who is seen here smoking a cigarette, which is not advisable for your health, especially in the current pandemic that we're in right now. Passionate writer. Obviously, we're really passionate on our side about Jack Kerouac. He's one of the more influential writers for me personally. But seeing as how this is a pub crawl, we are actually also going to be drinking on this tour as well. I'm not sure if you brought a drink, but we had a few here. with us, and you can't really, even if it's a virtual crawl and we're not in person, we should still have a drink. So I think on that note,
We should do a toast, Tarek.
I think that's a great idea.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Let's
Drinking
do
a toast. Ahem, 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 ahem. A toast. Here is to lying, cheating, stealing, and drinking. When you lie, lie to save a friend. When you cheat, cheat death. When you steal, steal the heart of another. And when you drink, think of us. Cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers. Cheers. Mm.
Ah.
So, Jack Carrick, I think all of us on this tour right now have some influential artist, musician, a band, a writer, an actor, a poet, somebody that really shaped the core of who you are. Might be more than one. But for many people, especially in the literary world, it is Jack Kerouac, and partially because he really did kind of push the boundaries of prose in a fairly unique way, and especially capturing the vibe of what was happening at that time. He was really capturing a lot of the anti-establishment that was going on in the post-World War II years, which, you know, at that time there was a very, very rigid, if you will, view of what traditional American values should be. And if you didn't fit within that box, you struggled. And there were a lot of people who did not fit in that box, who still, you could argue, do not fit in that box. And they struggled. And so what Kerouac somehow managed to do is to tap into that spirit a little bit. His style has influenced writers for a very long time. Now, obviously, On the Road is his best novel. We have a little poll here to just see how many people may have read On the Road or not read On the Road. But it was kind of his sort of breakthrough novel. But it wasn't his first, and it certainly wasn't his best. It was his most influential, but there were several others that he had written beforehand. So much of what he worked on as himself and as an artist comes from a lot of his time that he spent in New York City, especially in the East Village and the West Village, also in San Francisco. And there may have been a few drug-addled months in Mexico or Tunisia that might have influenced a little bit, but mostly it's so much of it is New York City. And there's a great quote that we'll have Devin do from Lonesome Traveler about his feelings of New York City.
So it goes, I settled down to long walks around beloved old Manhattan, a half-hour subway ride away. I've roamed the streets, the bridges, Times Square, cafeterias, the waterfront. I looked up all my poet beatnik friends and roamed with them. I had love affairs with girls in the village. I did everything with that great mad joy you get when you return to New York City.
Jack Kerouac. As we said, obviously On the Road is his sort of a seminal novel, if you will. And in his style, he rarely went back to re-edit. And I think that's one of the things that becomes unique about that particular book and his books after that. He really felt like his artistic voice was where he was at that time when he was at the typewriter and what he was feeling. He likens it to a person in a bar who's telling a story. And at no point during this bar story does the storyteller stop and say, wait a minute, I'm going to go back. I think I could say that a little bit more eloquently. It's that moment in time that makes that story unique and lively. And for him, that was part of his art. Love it, hate it. Many people did both. But it did create those beatniks. It really influenced so many of those people here. This was a fun book jacket I found on the road. Could any book jacket sum up the road on the road better than this? And the answer is yes. Many could. For some reason, this pulp came up. Any of these would be valuable options. And many of these. And, you know, he was so concerned about his voice that when he was typing out the original draft of On the Road, what became the final draft, he was concerned about the time it would take from paper to come in and out of the typewriter to change while he was typing. So he found a 120-foot long teletype roll that he fed in there so he wouldn't have to waste time, and allegedly wrote this over 3 weeks on a methamphetamine high. And this became known sort of as the scroll of On the Road. And there is an original version. This is obviously an artist depiction that we found falling from a very great height. But this is an actual real copy of the scroll. This scroll actually has the real names of the characters who he changed later on. Here he is looking at it very intently right now. But part of his influence comes from a friend of his who wrote him a letter one time while he was struggling for his voice. And this letter was very erratic. It was almost just like a huge a burst of energy on the page, getting rid of all normal prose and literary norms. And he found it fascinating. And so he used that as his inspiration to write many of his novels. And in On the Road, this character is called Dean Moriarty, but in real life, it would be his friend and ex-con, Neal Cassady.
And Neal Cassady is really sort of credited by a lot of the beat writers and a lot of scholars as coming up with sort of the foundation of this style called breathline, basically. A style that's sort of inspired by jazz and by music and by rhythm, but this idea that your writing should be dictated not by necessarily by the words on the page, but by the tempo and the tenor of how you speak. Neal Cassady lived a very crazy life. He went to reform school as a teenager for car theft, fencing stolen property. His friends, though, described him as a genius. He would spend a ton of time in the public library just reading anything he could get his hands on. He was an incredibly smart guy. He eventually took a trip to New York to visit some friends, and that's where he fell in with Jack Kerouac. And him and Kerouac would go on several cross-country road trips together. And these trips would eventually be the inspiration for the story that would turn into On the Road. He also later traveled to California and had a whole series of adventures with Merry Pranksters and Ken Kesey as the driver of the bus further, the sort of day-glow colored school bus roaming up and down the California coast, involved in a whole selection of different drug trips and acid trips. So what was Cassady really like as a person? Well, Tom Wolfe, who wrote Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test about these trips, described him like this. Cassady never stops talking. But that is a bad way to put it. Cassady is a monolinguist, only he doesn't seem to care whether anyone is listening or not. He just goes off on the monologue, by himself if necessary. Although anyone is welcome aboard, he will answer all questions, although not exactly in that order, because we can't stop here. Next rest area is 40 miles. You understand, spinning off memories, metaphors, literary, oriental, hip allusions, all punctuated by the unlikely expression, you understand. And that sort of gives a sense of not only how he was described in the book, but how he behaved in real life. Now, I want to mention one thing Eric talked about. We talked about the original scroll of On the Road, but the editors looking at that scroll weren't the only ones to take a bite out of it, so to speak. Because the thing is, the scroll is not just missing punctuation, character development, paragraphs, breathing room. It's also missing an ending. And at the end of the scroll, there's just a little like teared off piece and a handwritten note from Jack Kerouac saying, "Eaten by Patchy." And Patchy was the dog of another beat writer and personality by a guy by the name of Lucien Carr.
And actually, I meant to tell you that. So at the 50th anniversary of On the Road, they published the scroll version of it. Now, it's not actually a scroll, as you can see. It is in book form, but it does list it as one basically single paragraph, one single sentence. And I will tell you, I am a big Kerouac fan. I've read many of his books. I've read On the Road several times, and I have yet to take the dive into this version yet.
I'm going to go ahead and stop you there, Eric. I have read that book. And
I've read it too.
While I find it to be an excellent sort of piece of memorabilia, and if you're a big Beat Generation fan, it's a cool thing to have because it's just so historic to be able to see what it was originally like. You know, writers need editors for a reason. I know that's like incredible heresy to say with the Beat Generation writers, but the actual book On the Road is better than that original scroll. And that original scroll, if you try and read it cover to cover, it's really good insomnia fodder.
Oh, good. A good sleep aid.
Yes. In any case, I want to talk about Lucien Carr for a second, though, because, like, you know, Devin sort of mildly mentioned Lucien Carr and his dog, and he sounds like he was probably quite the wonderful dog owner. But as Eric mentioned, there was all these exploits and life lived for Kerouac even before On the Road was published and before it got him famous. There were so many books that he wrote. There were so many crazy adventures he had, and Lucien Carr was a big part of those. And it's really worth talking about because some of these exploits were crazy. So I like to think of Lucien Carr sort of as a precursor to Neal Cassady in a way because he had a similar sort of crazy energy to him. Lucien Carr, some of the best ways that I can describe him is he was a passable poet, mostly just really good to have around at a party. But also, strangely enough, he's one of the guys that really helped to cement the beat movement. Kerouac first met Lucien Carr when he was a student at Columbia, along with some little pipsqueak poet named Allen Ginsberg. And the three of them used to float down to the Village for parties, which is also where they met William S. Burroughs. William S. Burroughs at the time was living at 69 Bedford Street, and he frequently hosted some of the best parties for all of the best local criminals and bohemians in the area. William S. Burroughs, of course, being quite the criminal himself. In any case, as the group sort of developed a friendship, Lucien Carr started hanging out with one of William S. Burroughs' acquaintances, a man named David Kammerer. Now, David Kammerer was an openly gay man. Lucien Carr may or may not have been gay or bisexual or something in between. It's really never been confirmed. And there's been a lot of debate over the years as to whether or not he and Kammerer had any sort of affair. What we can really sort of glom onto is that Lucien Carr was definitely an opportunist. And for a time, they had a close friendship, and Kammerer very frequently floated him cash. Eventually, though,
I mean, Cameron was a little stocky. I mean, there's a report of late at night, like somebody walks into Carr's bedroom and there's Cameron standing over the sleeping Carr, who had crawled in through the window from the fire escape to get in and watch this guy sleep. So there was a little bit of an obsession issue.
Yeah. Nobody in this story is like hard and fast a good person. They all have trouble.
You and the beat movement were, sadly. They're great.
Yeah, that's like a general thing you can paint across the whole beat movement is like good writers, not good people, generally speaking. But in any case, this whole friendship eventually took a turn, and Carr kind of grew tired of hanging out with Kammerer, and that's when he started complaining to his friends that Kammerer was stalking him. And I'm sure that's probably around the time that Kammerer started sneaking into his apartment and staring at him while he was sleeping. And this all eventually came to a head in August of 1944 when Carr ended up stabbing Kammerer to death in Riverside Park. And then, of course, shortly after that, he immediately ran to his friends, Jack Kerouac and William S. Burroughs, allegedly offering them cigarettes from the bloody pack that he'd taken off of David Kammerer's body, and then also asked their advice for what he should do. And they told him to not turn himself in yet, wait a day, and also, we need to hide the knife. It's worth noting that good friends will get you a lawyer, but best friends will take you out for a drinking binge for 24 hours before you turn yourself in, and they will help you hide the murder weapon. That's how you know you got a bestie on your hands. In any case, all this came around. He eventually did turn himself in after about a day of drinking. And Carr ended up getting charged with second-degree murder, and William S. Burroughs and Kerouac, of course, got charged as accessories to that murder because, as I've mentioned, they helped him hide the knife. But also, funnily enough, they both just ended up getting off pretty light because Lucien Carr was able to easily claim self-defense on David Kammerer, and then they sort of let gay panic do the rest since Kammerer was well known as a gay man. This seems like a really weird thing to bond people together, but it sort of did. And New York Magazine eventually wrote up a piece on it calling it the murder that gave birth to the beats. My last favorite thing about this whole incident is that later Kerouac and Burroughs actually got together and they wrote a book chronicling this incident and discovered, and it was sort of just held off and hidden for a long time. It wasn't discovered until much later after their deaths. And my favorite thing about it is the title. It has one of those perfect, succinct titles that gives you the mood of the whole incident, gives you a sort of a concise picture of the whole scandal. It really just ties everything together. The title of the book was, "And the Hippos Were Boiled in Their Tanks." Admittedly, maybe not the best title. I'm also just going to throw it out there because I have read this book cover to cover, and it is absolutely fascinating if you're really, really into beat history, if it's something where you really are just interested in the characters, the people that were players in the whole scene, that whole thing. It's really, really fascinating to read. If you're just going there to pick up a book, it is not one of their best, and it might be up there for me with the original Scroll in terms of just good sleepy time fodder.
And it's interesting because the way Kerouac describes Lucien Carr and the day they spent sort of bar hopping is like he really does kind of capture that somber feeling of knowing like this is really Carr's last day of freedom for a very long time. Interesting side note: Lucien Carr's son would be Caleb Carr, writing of the Alienist series.
That's right.
But sorry, continuing on, Devin.
Well, so what I was going to add was this whole crew of early beat writers and personalities really centered around Columbia University. But when the beats at this point in the 40s and 50s were not drinking around Columbia University, they were down at the Village. And one of the places that all of these beat writers that we talk about, and especially Kerouac, went was a tavern called the White Horse. It is a second oldest bar in New York City, a place we go to often on our tour when we could actually go out and socialize in the air. But Carick used to come here all the time, and there's a ton of fun drunken Kerouac stories at this bar. Kerouac and Lucien Carr once kidnapped a dog that belonged to a woman that Kerouac was dating at the time. So they kidnap this dog and they take the dog with them to the White Horse Tavern, where I think people were like, well, that's Jack Kerouac kidnapping a dog. Fine, that's a normal Saturday. And they left his girlfriend a note that said, "Help, I'm trapped in the White Horse, come rescue," as a way to sort of entice her to the bar to come drink. Kerouac was such a regular here that he would often get belligerently drunk, yelling, starting conversations, what have you. He once was so drunk, he went into the men's room and somebody had written in permanent marker, "Kerouac, go home," scrawled on the door as a way to kind of just be like, this is the only way he'll see it and get out of our hair. But Kerouac had this zest for life, for drinking and for life and for living and for like talking to people. And he really wrote in a lot of his books sort of the way he lived, that kind of fast, emotional, explosive style. We found a quote from On the Road that really epitomizes this.
Dean was wearing a real Western business suit for his big trip back to Denver. He just finished his first fling in New York. I say fling. He only worked like a dog in parking lots. The most fantastic parking lot attendant in the world. He could back a car 40 miles an hour into a tight squeeze, stop at a wall, race among fenders, leap into a newly arrived car. Before the owner's half out, leap literally under him as he steps out, start the car with the door flapping, and then roar off to the next available spot. Arc, pop in, brake, outrun. Working like that without pause, 8 hours a night, in evening rush hours, after theater rush hours, in greasy wino pants and a frayed fur-lined jacket, and beach shoes that flapped. And this was really how my whole road experience began, and the things that were to come are too fantastic not to tell. Kerouac. Mostly.
Snaps.
You know what I love, and I'm just realizing it now, is just how much dogs have become a theme in the first part, right? I mean, like, as soon as I probably like a dog parking lot, I'm like, what's going on? So to all you dog lovers out there, this is for you.
Anyways, enough of this, enough of the dogs, because we're going to shift over to McDougal Street now. And it's very, very important to me that we shift over to McDougal Street right now. Because, why McDougal Street? Because of drinking. Drinking on McDougal Street is a time-honored tradition. McDougal Street was the place to go if you wanted to get debauched, if you wanted to get messy, if you wanted to get good and properly drunk, so drunk that you end up making out with a stranger in the back corner of a bar that you will not remember the name of tomorrow. McDougal Street is the place for you. That is the type of situation you want to get yourself in.
It sounds like it's the type of place for everyone.
Yes, it is. In fact, my favorite thing, we recently discovered an article in the New York Times actually citing all of the arrests and drunken behavior that goes on McDougal Street. And they talk about gentlemen gambling and fighting, soliciting for prostitutes, drunkenly throwing up on the streets, your typical Saturday night. And in fact, the police report, eventually they just kind of list on and on all of these things going on. And eventually they just sum it up by saying that people were, and I quote, acting in a manner subversive to public morality, end quote, which actually, hang on, I'm looking at this. That sounds like really formal language to me. Oh, yeah, that's because it's a report from 1860. This is an article from 1860 because McDougal Street has been running as a crazy center of debauchery for well over 150 years. And I would like to say that the students of NYU continue this tradition to this very day. And I was one of them. Cheers.
We have proof right there, fresh out of college.
That reminds me. I'm ready for my next drink.
Yes, I think we should
Yes,
do a toast.
Yeah, let's drink. Let's drink.
Who wants anyone care for a Heineken Light?
Devin,
What?
look at this face,
No,
Devin.
no good? What?
This is a literary pub crawl. We don't drink Heineken Light on a pub crawl. Is this the face of someone who drinks Heineken Light? No. We're gonna do shots here.
What are we doing shots of?
For you right here.
Thank you.
Don't worry about what it is. It doesn't matter.
Okay. So here's to McDougal Street.
Yeah.
To McDougal Street and debauchery for 160 years.
Cheers.
It's gonna hurt.
Ow. Oh.
But continuing on, so McDougal Street, the other reason we really wanted to hit on this area is because there were several bars on this block that were really instrumental to helping to sort of shaping the beat writers and also just the following that developed from there. And the Gaslight Cafe that we're showing here is really key to it. It was started by a guy named John Mitchell not too long after Howl and On the Road had really exploded onto the literary scene. And that really kind of helped feed that because this became a popular hangout for a lot of poetry readings, including Ginsberg and Kerouac, who would come here and read their stuff to packed audiences. In fact, Kerouac was actually interviewed on the steps of the Gaslight at one point in 1960. I know it's circa 1960 at least because I wrote that on this PowerPoint slide. But beyond the fact that it was for those, it was a regular hangout for Leroy Jones, who would later become Amiri Baraka, Gregory Corso, Bob Kaufman, Hugh Romney, and Diane DePrima, who is shown here as well. And it was said that at the Gaslight, beat poets would showcase their radiating works of nonconformity, sex, spirituality, and drugs. It was also said that the venue could really only hold 110 people legally, but John Mitchell often crammed in far, far more than that. And actually, I think you saw some snapping at the end of the Kerouac quote. That is also attributed to having been here at the Gaslight Cafe. Apparently a lot of the neighborhood was not too pleased about the reputation of debauchery, as well as the loudness that was happening at that bar, because some of those people lived on that street and slept and had children. And loud, raucous behavior at 2 o'clock in the morning is not really something that you love when you have a child. I can speak of that firsthand. So because of all the complaints that we're getting at all the applause and cheering and drunken carousing that was going on at the Gaslight, they instituted, instead of clapping, to snap. And so they would snap at the end of poetry, and this has now become a very pretentious way to show that you have some kind of knowledge about poetry whenever you want to applaud someone. So if you want to keep your pretension going, snap away. We also here had the San Remo Cafe, which was an Italian-run family diner for a long time, and another really big hangout for many, many writers, in fact, and some actors here as well. I'm actually blanking this actor's name. Never really seen any of his stuff because he's old and it's a black and white picture. But Gore Vidal used to hang out here at the San Remo, and it's actually said that one night he was here with Kerouac and picked him up and took him home and did what they used to say in the 50s, did the hanky-panky. You had Delmore Schwartz, Amiri Baraka again. And side note, Amiri Baraka's intro really into the beat world is he heard Allen Ginsberg read Howl and was very moved by it. So he wrote Ginsberg a letter, basically trying to introduce himself also as a poet. And the letter was on a roll of toilet paper, and it just said, "Are you for real?" And he mailed this to Allen Ginsberg, and Allen Ginsberg, of course, responded and said, yes. And a friendship came about, and they and Amiri Baraka became embroiled into the beat movement here. You also had Dylan Thomas was a regular here. William S. Burroughs, as you can see here, was also a regular. Ginsberg, I think, actually even met Dylan Thomas there, but they don't remember a lot about it because there was a lot of alcohol that was flowing that particular day. But it's also, Kerouac mentions this bar in his book, The Subterraneans. Now, if you've read The Subterraneans, it's all set in San Francisco, but everything that he's writing about and describing is what he was experiencing in New York. He just changed the setting on his own, and you can see, I love this quote, "Hip without being slick, intelligent without being corny. They are intellectual as well as they know all about Ezra Pound without being too pretentious to say too much about it." I was obviously describing the crowd there at the San Remo. And I love this book jacket, this pulp fiction style of book jacket.
Though I have to say, again, just in terms of, the jacket is good and pulpy, but also it's cracking me up because anybody that's read The Subterraneans might know that it's all about Jack Kerouac's love affair with a black woman. And so naturally the best thing to put on your cover for The Subterraneans is a nice lily white ginger-haired woman.
Oh my goodness! But the other real like the strong venue that we love on McDougal Street is one we go to still in their new location they're over on Christopher Street now, but they originated over here on McDougal Street, and that would be the Kettle.
Kettlefish, like Eric was saying, another great bar in the Village. Off McDougal Street now, they moved, but back when all of the beat writers, and particularly Kerouac, would go there, it was on 114 McDougal, and Kettlefish, I mean, you just had anybody who was anybody would go there. Diane DePrima, Amiri Baraka, Kerouac, Ginsberg, Corso would frequent it. And I think it is, it's most famous for us, or it's best known for us as the site of two beatings. So the first was between two of the biggest bruisers of the day, really just big, heavyweight, scary fighters, Andy Warhol and Bob Dylan. And oddly enough, it was over a woman, Edie Sedgwick. So there are two versions of how this fight actually went down. The first fight is, the first version is that they walked in and they just came to blows, in the middle of the bar.
Andy Warhol snapping on his fighting wig.
Right, just, Bob Dylan getting the fighting sunglasses on. But knowing these two characters, we don't really believe that. So there's another version that is a little more documented, but perhaps less entertaining. And the real version went something like this. Bob Dylan walks into the bar, sees Edie Sedgwick seated at the bar sees Andy Warhol seated with Edie Sedgwick at the bar and just glares.
And then Andy Warhol sees Bob Dylan and he just glares back.
And they sort of just stare at each other and then eventually separate and walk away. And that's the story of the fight. There's another
probably more realistic version, yes.
Probably knowing both of them, a more realistic version. The other fight, though, that is perhaps more relevant to our current tour is Jack Kerouac actually got in a fight outside the Kettlefish. And this one is not apocryphal. This one actually happened. So Kerouac is there, and he's in Kettle. He's very drunk, and he decides to sort of start mouthing off to a bunch of 1950s furniture movers. And these are big guys who move sofas up and down 6th-floor walk-ups all the time. And they're kind of like, it's fine. But eventually, he's like, no, we're going to step outside. We're going to do this. And they go outside. But Kerouac was not alone. I don't want you to think he was a fool. He brought a backup. He brought Gregory Corso, the poet, who was perhaps 5'4" and 140 pounds soaking wet. And begins on the street here, and it ends very quickly with Kerouac on the ground and being kicked repeatedly by one of these furniture movers, and Corso standing over him and saying, "Stop! Stop! You'll kill him! Please stop!" Which not the worst thing to do in a fight, but really just not particularly helpful at that point.
This really was an iconic a place for Kerouac, and in fact, it was so iconic that Gap, when they went on this a bit to start using dead celebrities to sell khakis, started off with Jack Kerouac. So you can see the bar sign here from the actual bar and the Gap ad because Kerouac wore khakis. And here's a couple others from that photo shoot.
Wait. No, okay. We have to stop this. We have to stop this right now. We need to look at these pictures a little bit more closely because that Gap ad is missing something very important.
Okay, hold on. Let me do a little quick Google search here. File share. Are you looking for this picture?
Joyce Johnson. Thank you. Yes, there is Joyce Johnson in that picture.
Right there.
Joyce Johnson got photoshopped out of the Gap ads, and I've been furious about it ever since because she's a very important figure, and she just gets photoshopped out because she's a lady. For those that might not know, Joyce Johnson, she was Joyce Glassman at the time, was one of the few female members of the Beat Generation. She was sidelined for quite a few years and just sort of called Jack's girlfriend the whole time, but she was an amazing writer in her own right. She was even there for Jack Kerouac's beatdown that Devin talked about at the Kettle of Fish. After the furniture movers got through with him, Corso dragged Kerouac to her apartment, hoping that she'd be able to stitch him up. And she, of course, took one look at his bloody, mashed up pulp of a face and said, "There's nothing I can do for this. We need to take that man to the hospital." And also, ladies, not for nothing, but Jack Kerouac and most of the Beat Generation are deceased now, and Joyce Johnson is one of the last living members of the Beat Generation, and she still writes to this very day. Her best-known work is probably Minor Characters. Wait. Minor Characters. Minor Characters, which is a memoir that she wrote.
We just lost your volume, Marissa. I'm not sure what happened.
Uh-oh.
Oh,
I
we
can
gained
hear
it back.
her.
Yep, I can hear.
Okay. Okay, that was weird. Anyways, her best known work is probably her memoir, Minor Characters. It's a memoir that she wrote about her time being in the Beat Generation. It's beautifully written. She talks about being a woman in that movement and how that was actually something kind of on the cusp of feminism rather than being a fully feminist time, because they didn't quite have the language yet for real feminism. But they did sort of pave the way for the next generation in the 60s. Well, really, here's the idea in her own words, just to give you a taste of the book. She says, repression breeds intensity. For me, the late 50s had a special intensity that has never been equaled since. The Beat movement lasted 5 years and caused many young men to go on the road in emulation of Jack Kerouac. Young women found the pursuit of freedom much more complicated. Nonetheless, it was my revolution. I didn't go anywhere. I just left my New York neighborhood where I'd grown up and moved much further downtown. I ended up accidentally with Kerouac in the center of the action, yet I always felt myself on the periphery. I was much more of an observer than I wanted to be. I didn't take notes, but I kept telling myself, remember this. She's an amazing figure, and like I said, she's living till this day. That's not her only book. She's written some really incredible novels, and actually she's written some really great critical pieces on Kerouac as well. One of the other major female members of the Beat Generation, since I'm now just up on the soapbox here, I'm just going to stay on it for a few minutes more, was, we previously talked about her just briefly, and you saw a picture flash through, was Diane DePrima, who, incidentally, ladies, is also still alive and well, and was the former poet laureate of San Francisco. And unlike Joyce Johnson, she actually had an easier time of it being recognized as a writer instead of just a girlfriend, for whatever reason, even though she actually still was also known to have the occasional fling with Kerouac and apparently even Ginsberg once. One of her most prominent partners, though, both romantically and in writing, was probably it was Amiri Baraka. In the 60s, they ran a really landmark, amazing literary magazine called The Floating Bear together, and that sort of brought them together and gave them quite a bit of literary fame.
They were, while they were running it, they were living together at Cooper Square, and diagonally across the street was the Five Spot Cafe, which we want to call because not only was it a Beat hangout and a Kerouac hangout, but because jazz was so influential for so much of how Kerouac wrote. He was really moved by the improvisational style of the music, the erraticness to it, and just the energy and the beat to it. And some people always like to attribute the fact that Beat Generation is also talking about the beats of music and the beats of jazz. But the Five Spot was Ginsberg, Amiri Baraka, obviously would go there. Sometimes they'd go to McSorley's across the street first, wet their whistles, and then head over to the Five Spot. Charles Mingus, Thelonious Monk. This is actually Thelonious Monk here getting into his Bentley, or Rolls Royce, excuse me. And then you have Charles Mingus here. And John Coltrane, Shadow Wilson, Charles Mingus. Charles Mingus actually played the very last night that the Five Spot was at that location before it moved over to St. Mark's Place. And it did okay at St. Mark's Place, but really moving from Cooper Square almost kind of ended it. But Kerouac once said in The Lonesome Traveler, if you know the proprietor, you sit down at the table for free with a beer. But if you don't know him, you can sneak in and stand by the ventilator and listen. But the bar's soul food eatery of the same name still plays jazz, but it is not related to the original bar. There was another one like it. But that kind of leads us to poll 4. And also, Ariel had mentioned, and something we've thought about is sharing some of the writers' drinks and putting that together. So kind of at the last minute, I wanted to do a little bit of a mixology for you here. While the poll is there again, you can shift it out of the way. But we know that one of Kerouac's favorite drinks was a margarita. And we know if we went to bar, he just ordered it. But if he was at home, he probably had his own variation of how to make a margarita. So I want to teach you the Kerouac version of the margarita. So at least the way I see it. So I would say first, take notes if you want. This will be recorded, so you can go back through if you don't take good notes, because if it gets a little too complicated for you. But we start out with obviously a shot of tequila in a, doesn't have to be in a lovely literary pub crawl branded shot glass, but that is an option. Pour that into our rocks glass. From there, you want to get 2 uncut limes, and 1 very large uncut lemon. And you just kind of want to give it a gentle squeeze over the glass. Just don't cut it. Just a gentle squeeze and a gentle squeeze. And then you want to take what's left and you shoot it. And that's how I imagine Jack Kerouac drank a margarita at home, knowing him as we do. Because sadly, he was a heavy drinker, and he had a lot of self-destructive qualities to him, which does not lead to necessarily a happy ending, even though it did fuel a lot of his writing. I will join you with an Arnold Palmer later on, my friend, as well. Thank you for that quote. But yeah, one of the people who really noticed a lot of his drinking and was such a huge supporter, and one of his closest friends of the beat movement is, of course, Allen Ginsberg.
And as we talked about earlier, I mean, Kerouac had a pretty strong relationship with alcohol, as did many of the beat writers, and also a correspondingly strong relationship with self-destruction. And Allen Ginsberg, one of the sort of foundational poets of the beat movement, wrote a poem that sort of begins, and it's an epic poem, so it addresses a lot of things, but it touches on some of the sort of self-destructive impulses of a lot of the beat writers and the people that he was hanging out with. And this poem was called Howl. Howl is one of the most famous works, not only of beat literature, but I would say of modern poetry in general. It was banned for a time, was the subject of a landmark Supreme Court case dealing with obscenity law. That basically said that, you know, if a poem has some artistic merit, even if it has graphic sexual and drug use and violence, the artistic merit still means that it is not in fact pornographic. So because of this poem, you sort of had that movement towards artistic freedom. And the poem Howl actually got its title from Jack Kerouac. The story goes that Ginsberg showed Kerouac a draft of the poem, and Kerouac said, "I've seen your Howl." And Ginsberg sort of took that and thought it really worked with the poem. And the poem starts and goes, "I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked, dragging themselves through the Negro streets at dawn, looking for an angry fix. Angel-headed hipsters burning for the ancient heavenly connection to the starry dynamo and the machinery of night, who poverty and tatters and hollow-eyed and high, sat up smoking in the supernatural darkness of cold water flats, floating across the tops of cities, contemplating jazz."
Yeah, and Ginsberg was really kind of catching and didn't realize that he was being very prescient when he said, "I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness," because at that time, his friends had yet to be destroyed and were soon kind of going to be. And very much so with Jack Kerouac, those lines really could be foreshadowing to Kerouac's end. And there's several examples of just how self-destructive he got.
There's a story about one time later in Jack Kerouac's life, he was asked for an autograph while he was drinking himself into a stupor at Lion's Head Bar on Christopher Street. And Jack Kerouac was so drunk that someone had to force the pen into his hand. And then the best he could do even then was just a giant stab of an ink blot. So.
One time was at the Gaslight Cafe, and he was drunk and doing a reading, and he stood up too quickly, and it was really low ceilings, and he smashed his head on one of the beams of the roof and had to stagger off a little bit drunkenly.
There's a quote from Subterraneans that deals with this. He's talking about a woman he met, and he says, "She was interested in thin, aesthetic, strange intellectuals of San Francisco and Berkeley, and not in big panoramic bums of ships and railroads and novels, and all that hatefulness which in myself is to myself so evident, and so to others too, though because 10 years younger than I, seeing none of my virtues, which anyway had long been drowned under years of drug taking and desiring to die, to give up, to give it all up and forget it all, to die in the dark star." So really positive, upbeat stuff with that one.
Absolutely, absolutely. There's young men who would talk about tracking down Kerouac again near the end of his life in his Florida home and knocking on his door and hoping to see their idol. And instead they were met with this ghost-like man, barely there, looking ashamed and often holding a bottle of something.
He was once quoted as saying 2 different things. One was, "As I grew older, I became a drunk. Why? Because I like ecstasy of the mind. I'm a wretch, but I love love." And later he wrote, "I'm a Catholic and I can't commit suicide, but I plan to drink myself to death."
Kerouac also, like his issues with alcohol, bled into his readings and his poetry readings. There are stories where he would, particularly later in life, he would have appointments and people, you know, would be like, "Oh, you're going to go do a poetry reading at a bookstore or at a cafe or at a bar, or even an interview." And he would get so drunk beforehand. You can find videos of him on YouTube where he's just sort of staggering through it and it just doesn't, he's reading these very powerful, moving words, and he's just sort of slurring and obviously wasted.
Yeah, on October 20th, 1969, Kerouac was then rushed to the hospital vomiting blood. He ended up dying later of an internal hemorrhage complicated by liver cirrhosis. It really is a truly tragic end to a very flawed man who chased life a little too hard, who was disappointed in his own failings, but in spite of it all was truly beautiful and wrote beautiful things.
Sometimes it's hard to separate the person from the artwork, and I think it's a struggle that we are constantly reminded of every day in our daily lives and in the news media, and he's one of those people. But he definitely left his mark and inspired a lot of people and struggled internally. And we want to end our segment with the last closing lines, which I'm going to read for you here from On the Road, which again has shaped so much of American literature and inspired so many people to get into journalism and writing and poetry and really trying to grasp on to that real spirit and music of life. And he ends the novel with the following. So in America, when the sun goes down and I sit on the old broken down river pier watching the long, long skies over New Jersey and sense all that raw land that rolls in one unbelievable huge bulge over to the West Coast, and all that road going, all the people dreaming of the immensity of it. And in Iowa, I know by now the children must be crying in the land where they let the children cry. And tonight the stars will be out. And don't you know that God is Pooh Bear? The evening star must be drooping and shedding her sparkler dims on the prairie, which is just before the coming of complete night, and blesses the earth, darkens all the rivers, cups the peaks, and folds the final shore in, and nobody knows what's going to happen to anybody besides the forlorn rags of growing old. I think of Dean Moriarty. I even think of old Dean Moriarty, the father that we never found. I think of Dean Moriarty. And that was On the Road. And thank you. That is our portion. That is our material that we have. We'd love to take some questions. Obviously, we could barely touch upon the life of a very complicated man and all his participations in the village. We'd love to take what we can for questions right now. I do want to put this out here as well. You can follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook if you are of the social type. If you like the story, you can like us for real on social media. And you can also tip if you are able to. I think us, like many of you, are probably out of work in this current crisis that we're struggling through right now. And if you are not able to tip, obviously we fully understand, because like us, some of you are struggling in this time. But we hope that we had a little bit of a chance to bring together and entertain and I guess educate a little bit, but mostly entertain and share some of our passions for what we do. And with that being said, we're going to start looking through at some questions. And right now I'm looking at one from Trevor. Did Kerouac ever spend any time at the Beat Hotel in Paris? I'm not really sure. Do you know, Marissa?
I don't know specifically what he was doing in Paris. So unfortunately, I don't know the stops as well as I do New York and San Francisco.
Eric, he definitely did at some point. My understanding is at some point he did during the 1950s. I know the Beat Hotel was much sort of more well known for Ginsberg and his companion Orlovsky, I was mispronounced that guy's name, staying there with Burroughs in Corso. And I think it was there that Burroughs actually completed the manuscript of Naked Lunch. So I think that he did stay there, but I don't think that it's as well known or documented how long or what his activities were there.
So Jeffrey, that's an interesting question that you asked. His question was Kerouac sober when he wrote? It's obviously that'd be somewhat speculative, but knowing him as we seem to do from our research, I would say a lot of the time probably not. And it's something that you find very common with a lot of writers. Hemingway was the same way, and the two are often compared to each other a bit, that they would have a drink of some sort next to them while they were writing. And I think there's several reasons behind why that was. And part of it is that alcohol, it does break down the inhibitions. So at a certain stage where you're questioning, you're overthinking, because I'm sure like me, many of you overthink situations, and so you don't make a choice because you're overthinking it. And alcohol helps get rid of those inhibitions, and you're more likely to flow. I also think that the reason why a lot of writers are often heavy into drugs and alcohol are much in the same ways. If any of you ever kept a journal, I go back through my journals, and my journals are never long pages about how happy I am and content in my situation in life. Always, the breakup that I'm going through, the struggles or my frustrations or my pain or my anger, because these are emotions that we don't like. We don't like sitting and feeling those, and we need a way to get those out. And alcohol and writing are ways to get those out. And so my guess, Jeffrey, is that most likely he was probably had at least a couple of drinks.
And Eric, if I can just add on to that also, while we don't necessarily know as much about him, I am going to dispute with you about Hemingway. Hemingway was very disciplined about his writing. He would write early in the morning. He would write sober and edit if he did while drinking. But Hemingway was never a person who would necessarily let the alcohol influence the act of writing itself. Kerouac, we don't know as much about his behavior, but we do know that for a lot of his work, it was written on Benzedrine. Benzedrine being basically 1950s Adderall. It was in asthma inhalers, and people would get the inhalers, they would break open the inhalers, and it was speed. So you can sort of see that influence in a lot of his writing with that quick movement, that energy, that viv, that verve, less so with sort of the depressing effects of alcohol.
So Terry, as far as doing pub crawls about some other of the beats, we've got a plethora of research, and one of the reasons we actually really enjoy doing these virtual tours is we're no longer limited by the amount of time that a person and distance a person can walk. And many of our actual physical tours are really based on what kind of route can we do in a realistic amount of time.
I saw it popping up in the chat. Somebody suggested that we do one of these things on Ginsberg, and I'd just like to say I'd be here for it because that would be
absolutely. And we've got a lot already kind of put together with it. And I would say that, by all means, I would put a little pressure on the Greenwich Village Society of Historical Preservation. There's a contact, Ariel Cates, and she's really good at dealing with their programming. And so you might want to put a little push on Aaron. Say, we want more of this. We want Ginsberg. But
we're here for it, yeah.
The Ray Bremser and Jack Michelin, I don't actually have those down, but I'm going to write those names in research because I'm curious to learn more about that. And thank you, Barbara, for the stuff. And yes, Burroughs for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Assuming Ariel.
A lot of craziness about Burroughs, yeah.
So much craziness, so many
tons of stuff there.
I'm into it. If you're into it, I'm into it.
We're totally into it, yeah.
Jack Michelin, yeah. Yeah, I mean, we have, and if you are connected, we do tours for schools regularly. And in fact, we often we'll try to sculpt a tour based on what the curriculum is that school is teaching at that particular time, wherever we can find, crossover. And it certainly is a lot easier in a virtual setting. And then that's one of the things that we're developing right now. Because I hope that you could catch how much passion we have for the material and the reading and the writers and whatnot. So that's always something that we're developing. And if you are connected or have those things, I mean, we have a Edith Wharton one that I've been working on for a while. We have an Edna Millay tour that we're doing and that we've done before, along with our normal, literary pub crawls. But those are obviously based around where, like, how long can someone's bladder hold from one bar to the next, and that's how we dictate what our route is and what we can do. Yeah, we have a lot in the works, and we're constantly researching. And this is a real boon to us to be able to take that research and put it together in some kind of presentation.
And we've got in, I think, 2 weeks, we've got an Edgar Allan Poe tour coming up as well.
Oh, that's fun.
Nice. Yeah, that's good. That's going to be fun.
Featuring the female poets and writers of the time. We have it there.
And this thing with the Millay tour is the bomb. Like, and like I said,
amazing. Yeah.
And like I said, I always like to try and prop up the female members of the Beat Generation. And, maybe someday we can get enough research under our hats to even do something like that. I think that'd be pretty fascinating. But I mean, there's so many writers, just male, female, everything in between, that are worth talking about. But yeah, I think the Edna St. Vincent Millay tour that we've done in the past is one of my absolute favorites because she was an awesome ballsy lady.
Absolutely, and we've tried our best. When you're doing early on in the tour, and when I first really started trying to revise the script that I'd inherited, it was there's a lot of information out there for the straight white male writer. It's just, there's a plethora of information there. And, we've worked really hard over the years to find everything to kind of get a better cross-section of what is actual American literature and not just what the tunnel vision is there. And very early on, coming up with writers like, Audre Lorde and Edna Ferber and Edna St. Vincent Millay, Sylvia Plath. I mean, there's a plethora of her right there. And I just got a book, I don't know if I have it out there, about a young blind woman who was a poet in the village for a while, and I never recognized the name and put that together. But we've been putting together material for a tour based on just some of the female writers and also a lot of the figures that kind of helped shape feminism during those early years leading up to women's suffragists and whatnot.
I mean, if you think about it, like we've got some fun, like cutesy stories that we like to do on our normal tour that are just really fun, funny stories about general bohemians. And at least one of the female poets of Bohemian Greenwich Village tried to secede from the nation. So like we've got good stuff there.
Yeah.
Gertrude Drick.
Right.
A great poetess, really. Just fine.
Yeah. She's a fine writer. So I understand. No, she's terrible, but she's funny enough and drunk enough that she'll secede from the nation if you let her.
Yeah, right.
She'll take over the Washington Square Park Arch.
Well, Lisa, Lisa's asking a really good question whether or not Joyce Johnson would ever agree to participate in a talk, and that's my long term as we're developing this. And like I said, we're trying to go beyond just doing a PowerPoint presentation. We're trying to kind of make it a little bit more fun and interactive and whatnot. But it would be amazing to try to get guest authors on there. It's just a matter of whether or not there's enough clout. So what I'm going to suggest is we're going to put together material that Joyce Johnson would want to be a part of. And then we're going to suggest it to her. And then all of you need to find her social media pages and just barrage her with like, hey, you should join up on this literary pub crawl tour that they're talking about. So wait till we get it together. But that's going to be the next step is when the masses request it. These literary greats, they step up.
As of like 5 years ago, she was still doing very public appearances because I remember her doing a reading at the Strand when she wrote The Voice Is All, which is a great book if you want some like new and interesting and very different insights into Kerouac, just sort of on a literary criticism level. And then if I remember right, she did something with Literary Manhattan at one point around that same time. So she's
we were there for that.
Yeah, we were. That's right. And so she's still kicking around. She still does readings. But I mean, that was 5 years ago, so I don't know. Things might have changed, but yeah, it's her, Diane DePrima, Lawrence Ferlinghetti. There's not many of the Beat Generation members that are still alive. But
Eddie Jones.
Yeah.
Jones is alive. Yes. Yeah.
A lot of people's kids too.
Jones is still alive. All the ladies are alive. I'm happy about it.
Yeah, the women in the Beat Generation really just thrived, and the men just died sad, tragic, horrific deaths.
Well, really. Because I think it's because women can moderate their drinking and the men drink less. Men
can moderate their drinking. That's possible.
I totally moderate my drinking. That's absolutely what I'm doing. I'm moderating my drinking.
That's why women writers need to continue to be more prominent.
I'm moderating my drinking.
Positions and running these things. But you know what's interesting. This is completely tangent, but it was something that was occurring to me lately as I've been researching. One of my problems is I'm so focused on all the writers of the past that I'm not always on top of the writers that are current. And so I keep trying to research who's up there and what's going on and trying to connect with other literary groups who might be interested in what we do. And I think there's been a real sea change in the number of female writers that are out there that are getting noticed, that are getting published. And there's a much stronger population of female readers. And it's interesting to me that so much of the media is still focusing a little bit on the male side of it, when I would be willing to say that 75% of the people who are reading books are probably women these days, and that easily 50 to 60% of the writers are women, and maybe more. I think there's, we're seeing a real change in that demographic. And part of the reason is, you write to your reading base. And if most of your readers are women, you're going to write things that would interest them more, not, it's just interesting to see how that dynamic has changed a bit. And I guess we're waiting for media and reviews to catch up. One of the later ones that I've been trying to incorporate in our Times Square tour, and I'm trying to find the book because I just recently picked it up. It's not a Village one. Sorry, Ariel. But I can't find it right now. It's gonna drive me nuts that I don't have it there. Where did it go? I'm gonna have to get back to you on that, but it's a great book though. You gotta read it. I can't. I've had too many drinks to remember the title, and I can't see it right now. I've been working on a review of it even.
Karen mentioned that she was
Manhattan Beach.
Have always been more women than men. I'd say that's probably true, but like Eric was saying, the media just is really slow to highlight that. It makes it a bit more difficult when nobody will paint it as such. but well observed.
Well, and I think, Karen, too, that the advent of television was a radical change, I think, in that demographic, because so many of these writers, when Dylan Thomas was packing houses and NMLA was packing houses when they were reading poetry, I mean, reading was something that everybody did. And then when it started to become more hobby, then that demographic really did start to change. And I think you're right that probably it was even more populous than we realized. But you know, it's no longer the means of entertainment anymore. Now it's almost like we're trying to encourage people to keep it because we're seeing the results in our society when people read less, or at least that's my soapbox thought.
It reminds me, though, when you're saying that, of the old story of Edna St. Vincent Millay in the Village, and how she was one of the first actually financially successful poets, and she made the majority of her money by getting rich people to hire her to come to their parties and read poetry aloud. It's just a very, very different world that would be the thing.
Imagine.
Yeah, exactly. That's their version of watching Keeping Up with the Kardashians is Edna St. Vincent Millay coming and reading somewhat salacious poetry at your party.
Honestly, I would prefer that to watching Keeping Up with the Kardashians. Maybe
oh my gosh, yes.
Yeah.
And capital A space capital R. Thank you for the kind comments. We appreciate it. We are trying hard to kind of mix it up. And Katerina, we definitely look forward to it. We're not going anywhere. Whatever the version is that comes out of this, you know, we'll be around and we'll be back. I can say for certainty that the people who are part of this company, I promise you we're not doing it for the money. Promise you. It's a passion for the writers and for keeping people involved, and that's why we're here, and that's why we do it. And in fact, there's a great quote that I think that we'll have Devin do that I think really kind of sums up the spirit of the people on our tour that Kerouac wrote. Oh no, Marissa, you were going to do this. Yeah. Sorry, Marissa. Sorry.
I mean, if Devin wants, this is my favorite quote, so I definitely want to do it if it's free. But
yeah, Marissa, please go. No, I always do the damn thing. It's you.
It's me. Okay. Yeah. Are we kicking that off now, or is there still more questions?
No, do it. That's it.
Okay, cool. So this is just the thing that I think sums up the tour best, and it's one of the most famous quotes from On the Road. It goes, "The only people for me are the mad ones, the ones who are mad to live, mad to talk, mad to be saved, desirous of everything at the same time, the ones who never yawn or say a commonplace thing, but burn, burn, burn like fabulous yellow Roman candles, exploding like spiders across the stars."
Nice. Mad ones.
Hold on.
Yeah, thank you, and apologies as we're learning some of these. We're keeping up with the questions that we've answered. We've got we've got this little window off to the left that gets scrolling with questions that we're going through. I was like, I think I answered that. So apologies for anyone we did that, but
and the whole questions dismissed thing. I was doing that because I thought dismissed meant that they were moved along and answered. So if we didn't get to a question, it did not mean that your question is bad. I am so sorry. Was not trying to say that.
Devin, you drink Heineken Light and you dismiss questions.
Light. This is what happened.
This was the Heineken. I'm going to blame it on the Heineken Light, not the Zoom.
This is what happens if you were drinking Jameson's like me. You'd be in a much better shape.
Well, I finished the Heineken Light, so hopefully no more of that.
No, it's been really interesting for us because this is the tech. I mean, this is technical. This is the first time. I mean, I'm gonna do something here. I'm gonna try. See video. I'm gonna switch cameras because I have a monitor. So to give you a sense of what we did this time around, so I've got a laptop so I could follow along with my presentation and know what slides were next, as well as trying to keep my script going on over here, as well as the keyboard that I was using here to kind of do it, as well as trying to look up to the camera and look to the side here. And we've got our props here. Here are my 2 uncut limes right there. I mean, it's been really fascinating. And with our third tour, I can talk to this camera now. So with our third tour, we each time we keep learning what works, what doesn't work, what's resounding, what doesn't. And so this has really been a fun exploration for us because, like I said, this is a medium. This isn't just television. This is something that's interactive. And as we get comfortable with the material, to be able to chat while somebody's talking and try to answer questions and move things around and getting over the fact that we're nervous because we're doing it for the first time, and I want to make sure the right slide is up and it's up there for long enough. And I'm having a drink, you know, and Marissa and Devin's drinking Heineken Light. I mean, it's been really fascinating to do that, but it is kind of our goals. We don't just want this to be a PowerPoint presentation. I mean, there's some fun to be had with this interactive ability here.
Yeah.
So apologies as we're kind of learning, but you know, I think I'm going to I am going to end the way I like to end all of my tours. And Ariel has heard this before, and she loves this poem. But I am going to do this because it is about the passion for us. And when people ask, like, why do we keep doing this, and why are we talking about writers that are no more? Why are we doing this virtually, and why are we trying so hard to keep telling some of these fun stories with a certain passion? And it's because we forget. We forget where we come from. We forget the writers that shape the lives we see every day. We forget so much of how much of our daily experiences were shaped by some of these people. And I don't think that there's a better clear example of that than a Greenwich Village poet who wrote a poem that you will soon recognize. And it starts, not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land. Here at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and whose name, Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that Twin Cities frame. Keep, ancient lambs, your storied pomp, cried she with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shores, send these, the tired, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. We forget, and I hope that on your tour today, we helped you remember. Thank you.
Thank you guys so much. Thank you all so much, and thank you so much, everyone, for being here. And
Ariel, thank you for organizing this.
Oh my gosh, of course. It's a gift, and it's a pleasure. And I love Emma Lazarus. I love her as a villager. I love her poem on the Statue of Liberty. It's just it's a good reminder of why we're here, and why literature matters so much.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you all. I'm very grateful, and
Felicia, I'm so sorry. I just saw that Felicia Lensborn was here. We use your pictures all the time still from the tours, especially Marissa. Some of the tour of you and me holding a glass in Brooklyn, that was Felicia's picture. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry to interrupt, Ariel.
Oh no, it's great.
Thank you for all that you do.
Oh, wonderful.
Well, thank you very much for having us. We had a great time.
Yeah. Have a great night. We'll see you again soon.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.